Chapter 1. The summer fete at St. Leonard's It was, by all accounts, the most radiant Saturday St. Leonard's had seen in a decade. Sunlight, honey gold and unhurried, spilled over the village green, illuminating the fluttering bunting that danced in the soft June breeze. The grass trimmed to a fine velvet hosted a patchwork of blankets, hampers, and parasols, beneath which the villagers assembled with an air of ritualistic satisfaction. Each face was familiar, each greeting warm and practiced, for the annual summer fete was as much a marker of tradition as the ringing of church bells on a Sunday morning at the edge of the green. Just beneath the gentle spread of an ancient chestnut sat Miss Jane Marple. She was a slight woman, unremarkable to the casual eye, but those who knew her well had learned to recognize the quietly penetrating intelligence that hid behind her soft blue eyes. Her hat, decorated with a faded rose, was perched at just the right angle to shield her face from the sun and, just as usefully, to allow her to observe her neighbors unnoticed. Beside her, in a sturdy folding chair, Mrs. Dolly Bantry sipped tea from a bone china cup and gossiped in a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Look at Colonel Prothero. Jane, do you see how he's glaring at young Billy Snaith for rolling on the grass? Honestly, I think he misses having a regiment to command." Miss Marple smiled indulgently, following Mrs. Bantry's gaze. Colonel Prothero, resplendent in his pressed linen suit and with a perfectly trimmed mustache bristling, was indeed watching the children's antics with a mixture of exasperation and nostalgia. Prothero, everyone knew, relished order almost as much as he relished recounting tales of the Boer War. His wife, long accustomed to his routines, busied herself at the lemonade stand, offering sharp-tongued commentary about the quality of the citrus. A few paces away, Miss Emily Farrow, the young schoolmistress, fretted with a stack of hand-drawn posters announcing the upcoming tombola. Her forehead was creased with worry, her first fete as a permanent member of the village, and she was painfully aware of the eyes that lingered just a moment too long on her every move. As she dropped a poster, she stooped to retrieve it. Her gaze darted nervously to the clock tower, then to the cluster of older women at the WY tent. Miss Marple watched her, noting the way Emily's hands trembled, the way she seemed to shrink from attention. A little farther off, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Edith Withers, presided over the cake stall with the air of a general at a field hospital. She fussed over her gooseberry tarts, shifting them by quarter inches, while issuing instructions to a pair of blushing teenage girls who had volunteered to help. The vicar himself hovered at her elbow, surreptitiously eyeing the treacle sponge, his guilty glance not quite as discreet as he imagined. Near the well-manicured rose beds stood Mrs. Edith Brindle, queen of the fete and guardian of the village's social order. Her smile was as wide as her sun hat, her eyes sharp behind rimless spectacles. Mrs. Brindle was the sort of woman who kept track of every teacup and every indiscretion. As she moved from one group to the next, offering encouragement here, subtle correction there, her hands never stilled a constant flutter, as if orchestrating the day's harmony. Miss Marple listened, sipping her own tea, as Mrs. Bantry catalogued the morning's small dramas. Had once again outdone everyone in the floral arrangements, though there were whispers about shop-bought roses. While young Tom Huxley, the grocer's son, had been spotted slipping 2 extra buns into his coat pocket. It was all deliciously ordinary. Yet for Miss Marple, there was no such thing as mere routine. The fete was, in her eyes, an intricate dance of personalities. She saw the subtle alliances who paired off for tea, who exchanged sidelong glances, who avoided whose company with careful excuses. The things people did not say were, to her, always more telling than the things they did, as the brass band struck up a hesitant march. Miss Marple's attention wandered to Harold Finch, the local solicitor. Finch, tall and neat, with hair thinning at the crown and spectacles perched precisely at the end of his nose, was standing near the old wishing well. He appeared to be deep in conversation with a nervous young man, whom Miss Marple recognized as Peter Drummond, newly returned from London and heir to the Drummond estate. Finch's expression was one of forced patience, while Drummond's was taut with suppressed anger. Their words were inaudible, but the tension between them was unmistakably taut thread in an otherwise festive tapestry. "Do you suppose Harold Finch is advising young Peter about the will again?" Mrs. Bantry mused, her own gaze following Miss Marple's. "That family has always been unlucky with inheritances." "Money does have a way of unsettling people, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle, but her thoughts running deeper. At that moment, a ripple of laughter drew her attention back to the main event. Mrs. Brindle had announced the beginning of the sack race, and half the village was lining up to cheer or compete. There was a flurry of last-minute betting, mild cheating, and much good-natured protest. For a while, the mood was light, the sound of children's glee floating across the green. Even Colonel Prothero cracked a smile as his granddaughter tumbled into first place, and then a scream, high, shrill, unambiguously real. For an instant, it seemed to hang above the fete, silencing even the band. All motion ceased. The laughter died. A plate clattered to the ground. The villagers, caught in the act of celebrating, turned as one towards the source of the cry of the old wishing well. Shaded by hawthorn and half hidden by the rose hedge, Mrs. Brindle, normally so composed, stumbled backward, a hand pressed to her mouth. Help! Someone no. Heavens please. Help! Miss Marple was on her feet in a heartbeat, though her movements were measured. The years had taught her the value of composure in a crisis. She approached the gathering, knot of villagers, at the well's edge. The crowd parted almost subconsciously for her, as though, even in their shock, they recognized something in her calm presence. There, the foot of the well, lay Harold Finch. He was sprawled in the grass, limbs arranged at awkward angles. One lens of his spectacles was cracked, and a small, battered notebook lay half open near his hand. His waistcoat, once cream and immaculate, was stained a spreading, sickly crimson. For a moment, no one spoke. The scene was too stark, too jarring, to be absorbed in an instant. Then Mrs. Withers gasped, her hands flying to her cheeks. Oh, dear Lord, he's been stabbed. Colonel Prothero, face gone gray, barked orders for someone to fetch the police. Several people rushed off, while the rest remained rooted. Torn between horror and a terrible fascination, Mrs. Bantry wept quietly, dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief. Emily Farrell stood rigid, white as her poster paper, hands pressed to her mouth. Miss Marple, silent, took in every detail, the absence of a struggle, the position of Finch's hands, the notebook, the careful avoidance of his body by most of the crowd. She observed the way Peter Drummond hovered at the fringe, face pale, fists clenched, the way Mrs. Brendel, moments before a pillar of authority, now looked small and terribly frightened. The siren of the local constable's car wailed from down the lane, a sound at once reassuring and ominous. As the police bustled in, the villagers melted back, murmuring, eyes wide with fear and curiosity. It would be easy, Miss Marple thought, to believe this was the work of some madman, random act, an incomprehensible violence. But she knew better. In St. Leonard's, nothing happened by chance. Every action, every slight, every whispered word of gossip was part of the village's living memory. The threads were tangled, yes, but not beyond unraveling. As Inspector Graves knelt beside the body, his notebook at the ready, he glanced up at Miss Marple. She offered a faint, reassuring smile. For though the day had begun in sunlight and laughter, something dark had crept into the heart of St. Leonard's Sand. She, of all people, was determined to follow the thread, wherever it led. The fate, that yearly rite of innocence and celebration, was over. In its place, fear, suspicion, and the first hints of secrets long kept. Miss Marple tucked her handkerchief away and took a step back, watching the villagers carefully. Already, she could sense the village beginning to close in upon itself, gossip and speculation blooming like weeds. But Miss Marple, more patient than the tide, was content to wait and watch, for in the faces of her neighbors startled, grieving, tense, she glimpsed the hidden truths that would, in time, reveal all. Whispers beneath the Whodunit is an odd thing about English villages. Tragedy arrives, not with chaos, but with a strange hush, as though the air itself is reluctant to stir the dreadful news. By the time the constable's whistle faded, and Inspector Graves had erected a makeshift cordon around the old wishing well, word of Harold Finch's death had already begun its silent journey through St. Leonard's, darting from one neighbor to the next, gathering shape in speculation with each retelling. Miss Marple sat again beneath the chestnut tree, her knitting lying forgotten in her lap. Around her, the village green had been transformed in a matter of minutes. Where only an hour ago children had tumbled in their races and grown men had argued over the merits of Mrs. Withers' jams, now stood clusters of villagers, heads bent in urgent, whispered conference. The brass band, their instruments gleaming uselessly in the sun, had retreated behind the trestle tables. A pious gaiety was gone, leaving only an echo of uneasy silence, punctuated by fragments of anxious talk. Mrs. Bantry, cheeks flushed and eyes wide, leaned in close to Miss Marple. I hardly know what to think, Jane. Who could possibly have wished poor Harold harm? Said. He was a solicitor, but even so such a thing is unheard of in St. Leonard's. Never in my memory. Miss Marple, never one to leap to conclusions, only nodded, her gaze drifting from group to group. There was a rhythm to the village's responsive choreography she knew well. It was in the protective huddles of women, their heads nearly touching as they shared their first wild theories. In the purposeful stride of Colonel Prothero, as he approached Inspector Graves, his back stiff with the assumption that someone, somewhere, needed his advice. He was a good man. Harold Finch, proclaimed Mr. Llewellyn, the church organist, to no one in particular. Not everyone liked his manner, but still, murder? He shook his head, lips pursed in disbelief, near the rose hedge. Mrs. Brendel stood with a trembling handkerchief, still organizing, even in crisis. We mustn't let the children wander over here, she said, corralling a few stray boys. Someone should see to poor Mrs. Finch. She'll be absolutely distraught. But as she spoke, her eyes flitted back to the scene at the well, unable to stay away from the terrible curiosity. The young schoolmistress, Miss Farrell, looked faint and terribly young in her pale summer dress. She clung to the arm of her older sister, who had arrived from nowhere with uncanny speed. The two stood apart, whispering in hurried tones. From time to time, Emily's gaze darted toward Peter Drummond, who remained on the periphery, silent and alone, his face blank, but his fists clenched at his sides. Inspector Graves a solid, Red-faced man of middle years conducted his work with quiet authority. He questioned those who had gathered near the well at the time of the scream, his tone gentle but insistent. Did anyone see Mr. Finch speak with anyone? Did anyone notice anyone behaving strangely? Come now, ladies and gentlemen, even the smallest detail may matter. Miss Marple, with a delicate posture and demure head, observed as each villager responded. Some, she noted, were eager to help, anxious to be useful. Others, she thought, seemed more anxious to be away. But in times of fear, even ordinary reactions might be tinged with guilt real or imagined. The rumors multiplied in the space of a single afternoon. By tea time, 4 different versions of the tragedy were in circulation. That Harold Finch had been struck down by a vagrant, some drifter from outside the village, that he had quarreled with Peter Drummond over the Drummond inheritance, which, Miss Marple recalled, was the subject of more than one heated conversation in the last weeks. That Finch had threatened to expose some local scandal, though no one could quite say what or whose, and, of course, that this was the work of madness, nothing more, nothing less. Each theory found its own audience, shaped by the speaker's suspicions and loyalties. Mrs. Brindle, Key, who prided herself on knowing everything, was sure it must be an outsider. Nothing like this ever happens here, unless it's brought in from the world beyond. Mrs. Withers, hands shaking, thought perhaps Finch had stumbled upon something in his legal work, something he oughtn't to have known. She whispered to her husband, who patted her hand without quite listening. A little later, the postmistress, Mrs. Cobb, offered her opinion to a group near the lemonade stand. I saw Harold talking to that London detective just last week, you know, the one who came to ask about old Drummond's will. Odd that. Very odd indeed. She glanced about, pleased to have contributed her bit to the tapestry. Miss Marple listened to it all, outwardly sympathetic, but inwardly sorting truth from fancy. She noticed how Peter Drummond, for all his efforts to remain unnoticed, drew the furtive attention of nearly everyone. The villagers looked at him with a mix of pity and suspicion. The man recently returned, an heir with uncertain prospects. His jaw worked as though chewing on some hard thought. Eyes, rimmed with fatigue, flickered from face to face, but met no one's gaze for long. Even as speculations spiraled, practicalities asserted themselves. The constable, young and earnest, moved through the crowd, asking that everyone remain until the inspector had taken their names and statements. Mrs. Finch was led away by Mrs. Withers and her daughter, both whispering reassurances as Mrs. Finch, in shaking, clutched their arms. The fate's tents began to come down, dismantled by grim-faced men. Laughter and music had fled, replaced by the scraping of tables and the muted sobs of a girl who had been the first to glimpse the body. Yet through it all, the pulse of village life continued. Mothers comforted children, dogs barked at the unfamiliar commotion, and the bell at St. Leonard's Church tolled softly for the 6 o'clock service, as if to remind the village that, in the eyes of eternity, this too would pass. It was, as the sun dipped lower, casting shadows across the green, that Colonel Prothero approached Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry, his expression grave. Well, Jane, I suppose you're forming your theories already, he said, tempting a note of levity, but falling short. Miss Marple shook her head gently. I have observed a great deal, Colonel, but I find that the most useful thing at such times is to listen to what is said and what is not. He nodded, frowning, then turned to watch the inspector. I'll say this much: if there's a clue to be had, Graves will find it. Solid chap, Graves. I hope so, Mrs. Bantry murmured, for all our sakes. A little later, as dusk fell and the villagers trickled away in 2s and 3s, Miss Marple remained seated, quietly taking in the transformed landscape. She watched as Emily Farrell hurried off with her sister, as Mrs. Brindle conferred with the inspector for the 4th time, as Peter Drummond finally slipped away toward the lane that led to his family home. The air was heavy with secrets, the sort that could never be fully hidden beneath layers of politeness. Before Miss Marple rose, she glanced once more at the wishing well, now cordoned and abandoned. It stood as it always had, timeless and silent, a relic of old superstitions. But tonight, it was something else, a boundary between the world as it was and the world as it had suddenly, irrevocably become. She gathered her knitting, thanked Mrs. Bantry, and prepared to leave. The sky above St. Leonard's was streaked with the colors of sunset, pink and gold, and beneath them, a darkening blue. In the quiet, Miss Marple thought she heard, just for a moment, the low murmur of the village full of confusion and questions. Longing for answers, she set off for home, her pace unhurried. There would be time, she knew, to untangle every thread. For now, she was content to let the village speak its piece. In the gaps and silences, in the anxious looks and the whispered accusations, she would find the truth. And so, as night fell, the mystery deepened, not yet solved, not yet even truly begun, but alive in the restless heart of St. Leonard's. Chapter 2. Quiet footsteps and hidden glances. The next morning dawned heavy with mist, the kind that seemed to absorb sound and slow the world to a hush. St. Leonard's, normally lively with birdsong and the clatter of milk carts, was subdued. Doors that might have been left ajar were drawn shut. Curtains, usually fluttering with the day's breeze, hung still and secretive. Even the church bell tolled more softly, as though mourning with the village for what had been lost. Miss Marple, as was her custom, rose with the sun. She took her breakfast in silence, sipping tea and buttering toast with delicate care. Her window, overlooking the green, offered a view of the old chestnut tree and, just beyond, the dark line of the hawthorn hedge where Harold Finch had fallen. A faint trail in the grass, nearly invisible, marked where his body had been carried away. Even now, a few curious villagers lingered at the edge of the well's cordon. Their voices low, their faces wary. She pulled on her sensible shoes, wrapped herself in a shawl, and ventured into the village. The day was already warming, the sun laboring to burn through the mist. The events of the fete clung to the green like a shadow. Everywhere she went, Miss Marple felt its chill. At the grocer's, Mrs. Cobb was already in full voice, her words half swallowed by the hush in the air. Never in my life, I tell you, such a thing here in St. Leonard's, and so sudden, too. He was there one moment, chatting by the well, and the next, oh, I can hardly bear to think of it. She paused, dramatically, eyeing the cluster of customers for effect. Mr. Llewellyn, the organist, who fancied himself an expert on all village matters, nodded with grave importance. It is the business with the Drummond estate, I'm certain. Finch was too clever by half, if you ask me. Always prying, always asking questions. Miss Marple waited her turn, listening with an air of gentle distraction. When Mrs. Cobb finally noticed her, she was met with a rush of concern. Oh, Miss Marple, dear, did you sleep at all? I can't imagine anyone in this village closed their eyes after yesterday. Her words were sympathetic, but her eyes glimmered with curiosity. Thank you, Mrs. Cobb. I slept as well as one could hope, Miss Marple replied. She paid for her tea and sugar, offering no opinions, and drifted out into the sunlight. She preferred, always, to observe, rather than participate in the rush of speculation. Villagers, she knew, told their stories most truly when they thought no one was truly listening. On her way to the churchyard, she passed Mrs. Withers, who was fussing with a row of wildflowers along the path. Mrs. Withers looked up, face one, and greeted her with a nervous smile. It's all anyone talks about, Mrs. Withers confessed. I keep thinking of poor Mrs. Finch. She's not well. Jane, Edith, Brindle, and I are bringing her supper tonight, but she's locked herself away. Can you imagine seeing your husband, though? Forgive me. I know it's terribly morbid. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on Mrs. Withers' arm. No need to apologize, my dear. It is a dreadful shock for everyone, but especially for Mrs. Finch. I am sure your visit will do her good. They exchanged a few more pleasantries, then Miss Marple moved on. Near the church, she encountered Inspector Graves and the young constable, both deep in conversation. Their presence in St. Leonard's, so often the backdrop for traffic complaints, or lost cats, now seemed almost ominous. Ah, Miss Marple, Inspector Graves said, managing a polite nod. Taking your constitutional, I see. I find it helps clear the mind, Miss Marple answered. Her eyes bright with their customary shrewdness, Graves sighed, looking over the notes in his pocketbook. We're making inquiries, of course. So far, it seems Mr. Finch had several appointments yesterday, all perfectly ordinary, some legal matters, a visit with Mrs. Brindle about the Fates accounts, and a private conversation with Peter Drummond. Nothing out of the ordinary or so, everyone claims. The constable, eager to show his diligence, added, Mrs. Finch insists she saw nothing unusual. Says Harold was distracted these last few days, but he wouldn't talk about it. It's work business, she told us. So Miss Marple listened carefully. And Mr. Drummond, Graves frowned. Peter Drummond is a troubled young man. He's recently returned, as you know, after years away. There's talk he quarreled with Finch something about the estate, I gather. But I hesitate to jump to conclusions. Villages, as you well know, Miss Marple, have a way of creating their own stories. Miss Marple's mouth twitched, almost a smile. They do indeed, Inspector. But there is often some truth, however small, woven through their tales. After a cordial goodbye, Miss Marple continued on. The village green, so festive yesterday, was scattered now with remnants. A fallen banner, a lost child's ribbon, a half-deflated balloon caught in the grass. The normalcy of these items only heightened the oddness of what had occurred. She paused near the wishing well, the focal point of all speculation. Here, the grass was trampled, the cordon stark in the morning light, as she lingered. Mrs. Brindle bustled up, clipboard clutched in hand. Her air of authority, a little frayed, was bolstered by habit. Miss Marple. Good. You're here. I wonder could you spare a few moments to help with the accounts? I know it seems trivial, but the Fates books must be in order, even with, well, all this going on. Of course, Edith, Miss Marple said. She followed Mrs. Brindle to the small hall behind the church, where the women's committee was gathered. Their voices pitched low and anxious inside. Miss Marple was handed a ledger and sat quietly as the others debated small discrepancies. Misplaced receipt, an uncollected fee for the coconut shy, a few shillings missing from the cake stall. The numbers, she noticed, did not quite match the records. Mrs. Brindle seemed particularly unsettled by this, flipping through the pages with growing agitation. Strange, Mrs. Brindle muttered. I could have sworn Harold reviewed these figures himself on Friday. He said they were perfectly in order. And now, Miss Marple watched as the other women exchanged worried looks. It was easy to sense their fear, not just of the murder, but of what might come to light. A village fete was an innocent affair, but even small sums and private rivalries could grow sharp under scrutiny. When the meeting ended, Miss Marple strolled back into the village, her mind busy. She noted Peter Drummond near the lich gate, smoking a cigarette, eyes fixed on the ground. He started as she passed, then offered a tight, polite nod. "Good morning, Peter." She greeted him kindly. He hesitated, then said, "Morning, Miss Marple. I suppose everyone's talking about it. I wish I could help, but I don't know anything. Truly, I don't." She studied him a moment. "It's natural to be troubled, Peter. You and Mr. Finch spoke yesterday." Key ran a hand through his hair. "Yes, we did. It was just about some papers. The will, mostly. There's nothing odd in that, okay? Just, I wish things had ended differently." He stubbed out a cigarette and walked away, shoulders hunched, leaving Miss Marple with the impression of a man carrying more than one kind of burden. As afternoon waned, the village gradually resumed its routines. Children played near the pond, though not too close to the well. Mrs. Withers delivered a basket of food to Mrs. Finch's door, turning with a look of sad concern. Inspector Graves continued his interviews, determined to account for every minute of every villager's time. Miss Marple, alone in her cottage, considered all she had seen and heard. The threads of the case were numerous: money, resentment, secrets barely hinted at in glances and hurried whispers. And yet, nothing was clear. The truth, she felt, lay hidden not in bold confessions, but in quiet gestures, in what people wished to hide, even from themselves. She poured herself another cup of tea and set her knitting aside. Outside, the last of the mist faded as sunlight swept across the rooftops. In the hush that followed, Miss Marple listened to the sounds of the village children laughing, a door creaking, a dog barking far away. Life was returning, as it always did. But the shadow of murder still lay long across St. Leonard's. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new questions, then, perhaps, a clue that everyone else had missed. The circle narrows. The following day broke clear and blue, as if in deliberate contradiction to the uncertainty that had settled over St. Leonard's. There was a strange crispness in the air. Birds chirped, and the scent of freshly cut grass floated from the manor lawns, but beneath the ordinary lay something unresolved. For all the attempts to restore routine, the village seemed to move more slowly. Its conversations layered with hesitation, glances lingering just a little too long on neighbors and strangers alike. Inspector Graves had made it known that he wished to speak formally to several individuals. The word of his list reached most households before the constable himself did. The village, ever a network of open secrets and closed doors, thrived on such knowledge. By midday, there were quiet discussions over tea tables and through garden gates about who had not been summoned to the vicarage, now serving as Graves's temporary headquarters. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had a visitor, Mrs. Bantry, clutching her hat and looking both excited and scandalized. "Jane, have you heard? Peter Drummond is to be questioned again." And Mrs. Brindle, too, she's in a dreadful state, practically barricading herself in her front room. Mrs. Bantry, perched on the edge of her chair, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And poor Emily Farrell. The whole village is talking about her. She's become quite the subject of speculation. Miss Marple poured tea, her hand steady. "One must remember, Dolly, that everyone becomes a subject of speculation in a small village, especially after something so shocking. We must be careful not to see guilt in every sign of distress." "But what about Peter?" Mrs. Bantry pressed, eyes wide. "You saw how pale he was yesterday. Everyone knows he and Finch quarreled over the estate." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. "It is true, Peter was upset, but it is also true that he has had a trying few months. Returning home can be more unsettling than leaving it." The talk moved on to Mrs. Brindle, whose composure had indeed fractured since the murder, while she had thrown herself into organizing help for Mrs. Finch. Many noted the edge in her voice and the rapidity with which she locked her doors after sunset. Mrs. Bantry speculated about secrets in the fate accounts. "You heard what happened with the missing shillings?" But Miss Marple thought Mrs. Brindle's nervousness bespoke something less criminal and more personal. After Mrs. Bantry left, Miss Marple took her knitting to the green, where Inspector Graves' interviews had begun in earnest. The vicarage, usually a place of calm, now echoed with nervous footsteps and muffled voices. From her bench beneath the chestnut, Miss Marple watched villagers arrive, some resolute, others visibly anxious. She observed body language, the hands that trembled on doorknobs, the faces that emerged flushed or pale. Peter Drummond was the first to leave an interview. His face was drawn, and his eyes darted as he strode past the watching villagers. He hesitated when he saw Miss Marple, then, perhaps seeking kindness, approached her bench. "It feels as if everyone is waiting for me to confess, Miss Marple," he said, quietly, his voice brittle. I haven't done anything wrong. I only argued with Finch. Nothing unusual for us. He could be difficult." She looked at him with a softness that never suggested pity. "Peter, grief and suspicion are often twins. Pay them no mind. These things will pass in time, and truth, I find, is rarely as tangled as it first appears." He gave a wan smile and moved on. Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, the way he glanced back, still half expecting to be followed. A short while later, Mrs. Brindle emerged from the vicarage, her posture rigid, lips pressed in, a thin line. She marched across the green, keys jangling in her hand. She ignored the stares of the villagers, but, as she drew near the bench, Miss Marple greeted her gently. "Edith, and you hoped the inspector was not too hard on you?" Mrs. Brindle, startled, then forced a smile. "Oh, not at all. He is only doing his duty, but I wish this were over. I feel as though every mistake I've ever made is being tallied up and reviewed." Her laugh was brittle, almost pleading. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "I imagine most of us feel that way under the circumstances." From the church porch, Miss Farrell emerged with Inspector Graves. She looked almost ghostly, her skin pale and eyes red-rimmed. She glanced at Miss Marple as if about to speak, but then her sister, Ruth, appeared and guided her away. "Dear quiet. Retreat." Heads bowed together was the subject of fresh whispers. The early interviews done, Inspector Graves walked across the green, stopping to consult his notebook. He paused by Miss Marple, offering a respectful nod. "Mrs. Marple, I wonder if I might have a word." She smiled. "Of course, Inspector." He sat beside her, glancing at the thinning crowd. "Do you see much, I imagine, sitting here? More than most. I find one sees a great deal by simply being quiet," she said, almost apologetically. Graves hesitated. "There are things that trouble me." Peter Drummond's row with Finch was heated. "Yes, but I'm not convinced it was enough for murder." Mrs. Brindle was anxious about the fate's finances, but I've seen nothing suggesting theft or real malice. Emily Farrell is young, nervous, but I sense she's frightened of something other than the inspector's questions. Miss Marple waited, knowing the inspector was working through his own doubts, and then Graves continued. "There is Mrs. Finch. Grief can make people act in strange ways, while her refusal to speak in any depth about her husband's work seems odd." Miss Marple nodded, thinking back to her brief encounter with Mrs. Finch through the closed door. "Some wounds go deeper than others, Inspector. I wonder what Harold Finch might have told her in his final days." Graves closed his notebook. "We're at the point where every suspect is obvious, and no suspect quite fits. But something is being hidden of that I am certain." With that, he rose and returned to his duties, leaving Miss Marple in contemplation. As the day wore on, the villagers' alliances became clearer. The postmistress sided with Mrs. Brindle, speaking loudly of her honesty. The schoolmistress, Miss Farrell, retreated from public view, her absence fueling fresh gossip. Even Colonel Prothero, who prided himself on detachment, was seen conferring with the vicar in grave tones. By dusk, the sun painted the green in gold and violet. A palpable tension hung over St. Leonard's. Suspicion had found fertile ground. Some faces, like Peter Drummond's, revealed the strain. Others, like Mrs. Brindle's, grew tight and secretive. In every polite conversation, Miss Marple sensed the underlying question. Who among us did this? She returned to her cottage, pausing to watch the last of the day's light fade from the green. The circle of suspicion had narrowed, but the truth remained elusive. She knew, as she reached for her knitting, that secrets did not stay buried for long in villages. And somewhere, among the villagers' anxious faces and defensive words, the true story was waiting to be unraveled. Miss Marple settled in her chair, the gentle click of needles keeping her company. The evening air carried the faintest whisper of coming rain. Promise that whatever darkness still lingered over St. Leonard's, it would, in time, be washed away. Chapter 3. A stitch unraveled that night. Rain finally arrived, first as a distant rumble, then in earnest, drumming on roofs and window panes, washing the village green and leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and grass. Morning dawned gray and clear, with puddles pooling beneath the chestnut and the earth freshened. But the uncertainty in St. Leonard's felt only more intense. Though the rain had pressed every worry deeper into the soil, Miss Marple, wrapped in her blue shawl, rose early, as was her habit. The previous day's conversations echoed in her mind. Mrs. Brindle's brittle nervousness, Peter Drummond's hunted eyes, Inspector Graves's growing frustration. She watched the green from her window as village life resumed its careful rhythms. Even in tragedy, the milkman made his rounds. Dogs needed walking, and children kept closer than usual, splashed in puddles with guilty delight. She set out with her shopping basket, planning to visit the bakery and, perhaps more importantly, to observe. She believed, as always, that the smallest things often mattered most. The stray word, the overlooked glance, the detail that seemed unimportant until it was seen from just the right angle in the lane. She met young Emily Farrell, umbrella hooked over one arm and her satchel heavy with books. "Good morning, Emily. Off to the school so early?" Miss Marple said, matching her pace. Emily nodded, her usual brightness dulled. "I can't stand to stay at home. Ruth worries, but I need to keep busy." She bit her lip. Inspector Graves asked more questions last night about the fate, about Mr. Finch. I hardly knew what to say. Miss Marple smiled kindly. It can be difficult to recall every detail, especially when one is anxious. Sometimes, though, a small thing, sound, a smell, a piece of paper, will bring it all back. She let the words hang, watching Emily's face for any flicker of recognition. Emily hesitated, glancing down at her satchel. There was something odd, now that you mention it. After the fete, when everything was so confused, I went back for my lesson plan book. I remember seeing Mr. Finch's notebook on the grass near the well, but then, when the police arrived, it was gone. She looked up, worried. Should I have said something? Miss Marple's heart gave a gentle leap, though her voice remained. I'm sure the police would wish to know. Notebooks are easily lost in confusion, but sometimes they are taken intentionally or not. She touched Emily's hand lightly. You've done nothing wrong, my dear. Sometimes memory arrives slowly. Emily smiled, some of her tension easing, and hurried on toward the school. Miss Marple watched her go, thoughtful. The mention of the missing notebook settled in her mind, like a weight on a scale, not enough to tip the balance, but enough to notice. At the bakery, the air was thick with gossip, as well as the scent of warm bread. Mrs. Cobb, the postmistress, was in rare form, holding forth to anyone who would listen. And now, Mrs. Finch won't speak to anyone, not even the vicar's wife. She's locked herself away, as though we've done her harm. I say, it's unnatural, that sort of grief. Unnatural. She spotted Miss Marple and lowered her voice. You're a sensible soul, Jane. You must have some notion of what's really going on. Miss Marple selected a seeded loaf. I find, Mrs. Cobb, that the truth is rarely as dramatic as rumor. Sometimes, people hide for reasons that have nothing to do with guilt. The baker's assistant, a quiet boy named Tom, brought over Miss Marple's change. As he handed her the coins, he whispered, Ma'am, there's something I found after the police left the green last night. It's probably nothing, but he pressed a small scrap of paper into her hand. It was caught under the bench, near the well. Miss Marple thanked him, and tucking the paper away, finished her shopping. She returned home and sat at her kitchen table, unfolding the scrap. It was a torn corner of what looked like legal stationery. Harold Finch's handwriting, small and precise, visible at the top. Only a few words remained, but they made her pause. Mustn't know about, and a set of initials, E.F., Emily Farrow, or someone else. Miss Marple considered it. The note could have referred to any number of things: financial records, personal secrets, or nothing at all. But coupled with the missing notebook, suggested someone had taken steps to remove evidence from the scene. She tucked the scrap into her diary and went out once more, heading for Mrs. Brindle's. The fete organizer greeted her at the door, visibly anxious. Oh, Jane, I'm in a dreadful state. The inspector's questions never end, and now I've misplaced my own account ledger. It's as though the whole village is conspiring to lose its senses. Miss Marple listened sympathetically as Mrs. Brindle recounted every small mishap of the past week: missing receipts, odd phone calls about the fate's funds, a shadow scene moving near the vicarage after dark. I never thought our little celebration could turn so sour, she said, wringing her hands. Do you think someone took the money? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that sometimes things become confused in the aftermath of shock. But perhaps, Edith, there's something else on your mind. Mrs. Brindle looked at her sharply, then away. Well, it's nothing. I thought I saw Harold Finch arguing with Peter Drummond near the well, just before it happened, but perhaps I'm imagining it. Everything is so jumbled. Miss Marple patted her arm. Thank you, Edith. You've been through a great deal. As she left, she saw Inspector Graves entering the green, speaking with the constable and pointing toward the hedges. Graves had the determined air of a man refusing to be baffled by village obfuscation. Miss Marple approached, unobtrusive, as always. Inspector, she said, I wonder if you're aware that Harold Finch's notebook has yet to be found. Graves blinked. No, I wasn't. We assumed it had been overlooked, but none of the officers recall seeing it after the crowd cleared. Are you suggesting? I'm merely repeating what I've heard, Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling. But perhaps there are small things, seemingly unimportant, that bear looking into. Graves nodded, jotting a note. Thank you, Mrs. Marple. Sometimes I wonder if I'm chasing shadows. She smiled. Shadows, Inspector, are often cast by something solid. As the day lengthened, the village mood grew tense again. People eyed one another. Whispers followed each new rumor. Peter Drummond was seen hurrying through the churchyard. Emily Farrow kept to her classroom with the door locked, and Mrs. Brindle patrolled the green, keys jangling, her anxiety barely concealed. Miss Marple spent the evening piecing together her observations: the missing notebook, the torn scrap implicating E.F., the financial confusion at the fete. These things did not fit neatly together, but neither did they belong entirely apart. After sunset, as the last light faded, Miss Marple wrote a brief letter addressed to herself, a trick she sometimes used to clarify her thoughts. In it, she listed every oddity, every contradiction, every thread that had begun to unravel since the fete. She did not expect clarity yet, but she felt, for the first time, a faint pull of the solution, like a knot, invisible, but real, tightening. In the darkness, St. Leonard's had always seemed a place of comfort. Its mysteries no more troubling than the riddle of who would win the next flower show. But now, Miss Marple sensed something deeper was at work, a tangle of old loyalties, new fears, and secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. And as she set down her pen and folded her hands, she promised herself she would follow the thread, no matter where it led. Confrontations and secrets with every passing day since the fete. The normally tranquil rhythm of St. Leonard's became more frayed. A subtle tension hung in the air a sense that the village was collectively holding its breath, waiting for some new revelation to break the impasse. Conversations grew quieter, faces more closed, and the familiar rituals of village life morning post, church bell. The clang of the grocer's door were accompanied by a restless undercurrent of suspicion and curiosity on a particularly blustery afternoon. Miss Marple left her cottage, intent on the circuit of the green, and found the village square abuzz with subdued but urgent conversation. News had spread about the missing notebook Inspector Graves, never one to underestimate the power of a lost document, had asked that everyone who was present at the fete retrace their steps and recall any detail, however insignificant, that might explain its disappearance. Miss Marple, her shawl fastened tightly against the wind, paused at the bakery to buy a scone and found Mrs. Cobb deep in discussion with Mrs. Withers. "Hi, heard it from Tom," he said. Miss Marple had a bit of paper with Harold's handwriting. Mrs. Cobb whispered, eyes wide. "And now the inspector's looking for a notebook. What do you think it means?" Mrs. Withers, ever the peacemaker, shook her head. "Perhaps it's nothing at all, Mabel, but I do hope, for all our sakes, that the inspector finds it soon. We can't go on like this," Miss Marple interjected with a warm smile, diffusing the tension. "Most mysteries are simpler than they seem at first, ladies. Sometimes a notebook is just a notebook, okay?" But the unease did not dissipate so easily. Leaving the bakery, Miss Marple noticed Peter Drummond pacing the edge of the green hands, deep in his coat pockets. His hair was rumpled and his face drawn. Sensing his agitation, Miss Marple approached gently. "Peter, a walk can be a great comfort," she said. "Would you mind if I joined you?" He managed a grateful nod, and together they walked beneath the budding linden trees. For a while, neither spoke. The silence was companionable, broken only by the wind and the distant sound of a dog barking. "I feel as if everyone is looking at me," Peter finally admitted. "It's as though they've decided I must be guilty of something, if not murder, then at least being the Drummond who always brings trouble." Miss Marple's gaze was sympathetic. "Villages are full of memory, Peter. Sometimes the past casts a longer shadow than it ought, but shadows are not substance. You mustn't let them weigh you down." He stopped, fists clenched. "Latino, I argued with Finch that afternoon. It's not just about the will. He hinted that he knew something about me, something from before I left for London, but I can't imagine what he meant." He glanced away, jaw tight. He was always clever at finding people's weak spots. Miss Marple said nothing, but the admission lingered between them, a suggestion that Finch had not only legal knowledge, but also a taste for leverage, and that Peter's return had stirred up old resentments. They parted near the churchyard. And as Peter disappeared down the lane, Miss Marple saw Emily Farrell emerging from the vestry, a bundle of exercise books in her arms. Emily nearly dropped them when she saw Miss Marple, then recovered with a shaky smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, you startled me. I was just making sure the children's essays were safe." "I'm afraid I haven't been very organized lately." Miss Marple studied the young woman's anxious face. "We all have unsettled times, Emily, but you know, sometimes talking helps." Emily looked around as if to ensure no one could overhear. "It's so hard to know whom to trust. Everyone is watching. I thought about the notebook all night. I did see it after the fete, but when I looked for it later, it was gone." And she hesitated, biting her lip. "Someone left a note in my desk at school. Just a few words. Be careful what you remember." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did you recognize the handwriting?" Emily shook her head, near tears. "No, but it frightens me. I keep thinking of that scrap you showed me, the initials, E.F. It must mean me. But I haven't done anything wrong." Miss Marple comforted her, promising to speak to Inspector Graves about the note. But as Emily hurried off, Miss Marple could not help but feel a fresh surge of worry. Was Emily being threatened or manipulated into silence? Later that afternoon, the Women's Institute gathered for an emergency meeting, ostensibly about the fate of next month's garden competition. But the real topic was, inevitably, Harold Finch's death and the mounting strain in the village. Mrs. Brindle presided. With forced briskness, "I can assure you all, the fate accounts will be settled," Mrs. Brindle announced. There was a discrepancy, but nothing that cannot be explained by a few misplaced receipts. Her defensive tone caught the attention of several members. Mrs. Withers cleared her throat delicately. "Edith, perhaps, if you showed us the ledgers, we could help you find the missing amounts." Mrs. Brindle stiffened. "That won't be necessary. I have everything under control." She gathered her things with unusual haste and left before the meeting could be adjourned. Outside, Miss Marple caught up with her. "Edith, forgive me, but you seem rather troubled. If there's something weighing on your mind, you needn't carry it alone." Mrs. Brindle hesitated, eyes starting left and right. "It's just Jane. I didn't want anyone to know, but there was a sum missing, even before the fete began. I meant to ask Harold Finch for advice, but now," she shook her head. "He was the only one who really understood these things. I keep thinking if I'd only spoken sooner." Miss Marple squeezed her hand. "Agatha, the truth has a way of emerging, Edith, and sometimes the things we fear are not so terrible as the secrets we keep." At dusk, a sudden commotion erupted on the green. Mrs. Cobb, returning from the post office, claimed to have seen someone rifling through the hedge near the wishing well. The constable responded at once, finding only muddy footprints and a few broken branches. Rumors were quick to start, with someone looking for the notebook or hiding something else. That night, as lamps winked on in cottage windows, the village seemed to settle deeper into its siege of silence and suspicion. Miss Marple sat at her table, diary open, reviewing her notes. Peter's confession of an old conflict with Vince Mealy's anonymous warning, and her fear misses. Brindle's hidden anxiety over missing funds, the scrap of Harold's note mentioning EF. The desperate search for the missing notebook. The pattern was emerging, though the threads remained tangled. What was Finch's connection to each of these troubled souls? Was it money, secrets, or something more deeply personal? And who, amid all the confusion, had most to gain or most to lose by Finch's death? Miss Marple blew out her lamp, her thoughts swirling with possibilities. Somewhere in the darkness, the truth waited, not just about Harold Finch's murder, but about the tangled web of secrets the fate had so violently unraveled. She would listen and watch and wait. The answers, she knew, would come not as confessions, but as subtle slips, stray glances, and the tiniest cracks in the village's careful facade. The green outside lay silent, the well and hedges now, haunted by more than superstition. In the stillness, St. Leonard's braced itself for what would come next for the secrets. Once stirred, were not so easily returned to slumber. Chapter 4. Another twist in the thread. The rain relented as dawn broke on Friday, leaving St. Leonard's washed and glistening under a pale sun. Villagers emerged cautiously into a morning that felt newly fragile, exchanging greetings with eyes that betrayed exhaustion more than warmth. Yet the routines pressed on. The baker's bell rang, milk bottles clinked on stone steps, and schoolchildren splashed through lingering puddles on their way to lessons. Miss Marple moved through the green with her usual gentle tread, but her thoughts ran rapid beneath her calm. Her observations from the previous evening still echoed Peter's bitterness and fear, Emily's silent dread, Mrs. Brindle's concealed anxieties. But something else pressed at her now, a faint sense that the threads she'd gathered had not yet revealed their full pattern. By midday, rumors of the mysterious footprints by the well had eclipsed even the missing notebook in village talk. Mrs. Cobb, who saw herself as the village's informal news service, announced at the post office that the real villain had been caught, at least his muddy boots had. Yet despite the inspector's efforts, no one came forward to claim the shoes that matched the prints, and no new evidence was found at the well. It was in this unsettled, atmosphere that the week's most shocking development arrived. As children tumbled into the schoolyard at the lunch hour, the vicar, Mr. Withers, hurried up, the lame face blanched, breath short, his usual serenity shattered. He called urgently for the constable, drawing villagers from every shop and cottage. Miss Marple, sensing trouble, followed at a discreet distance. The commotion had centered at the school, where a crowd had gathered near the side garden. Emily Farrow stood at the center, white-faced, flanked by her sister Ruth and several wide-eyed students. At their feet lay a small tin box, its lid twisted open and its contents scattered: letters, receipts, and, astonishingly, the missing fate ledger. Inspector Graves pushed through the throng, joined by the constable. He knelt and examined the scattered papers. "Who found this?" Kay asked, voice taut. I did," Emily stammered. "Was under the lilac bush by the playground. The children saw something shiny, and when I went to look, I found the box. I don't know how it got there." Mrs. Brindle, summoned by Mrs. Withers, arrived breathless and agitated. She fell to her knees, hastily rifling through the documents. "My account, so, thank heavens. Why would anyone take them and leave them here?" The villagers erupted into a torrent of speculation. Some thought it a clumsy attempt at theft, others a deliberate effort to draw suspicion. It was Emily, still trembling, who offered the detail that would set the village on edge once more. There was something else, she whispered, glancing nervously at the inspector. A letter addressed to Harold Finch, but unopened. I recognized his handwriting. It was tucked at the very bottom, as if someone had tried to hide it. Graves took the letter, holding it carefully. The envelope was slightly torn, but otherwise intact. The postmark was from 2 days before the fate. "Did anyone touch this besides you?" he asked. Emily shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, I brought it to you at once." The inspector nodded, tucking the letter into his pocket. "Thank you, Miss Farrow. This may prove important." Whispers spread like wildfire. Why would a letter for Harold Finch be hidden with Mrs. Brindle's ledger? Who had placed the box in the school garden, and why now, just as the search for the notebook had become urgent? Theories blossomed, some wild, some worryingly plausible. Perhaps Finch had been blackmailing someone, or the ledger's discrepancies were more than innocent error, or Emily herself was involved. Miss Marple listened, eyes narrowed in thought. The school garden, with its convenient shrubs and daily bustle, was a perfect place for a nervous thief to dispose of incriminating evidence, perhaps in haste, perhaps intending to recover it later. But the timing troubled her. Why now, when the hunt for clues had grown most frantic? Inspector Graves called for statements. Miss Marple gently approached Ruth Farrow, who was comforting her sister. "Ruth, my dear, forgive me, but did Emily ever mention seeing anyone near the school after the fate?" Ruth frowned. "She did mention hearing footsteps outside her window late Wednesday night." We thought it was just a fox in a rubbish bin, but now, she shook her head, lips pressed tight. It's all so frightening, Miss Marple. Emily hasn't slept in days. Miss Marple squeezed her hand. Thank you, dear. It's best to remember every little thing, even if it seems unimportant. Throughout the afternoon, Inspector Graves's questions grew more pointed. He asked Mrs. Brindle to account for every penny and every visitor to her home. He asked Emily and Ruth about their movements in the school's after-hour security. He visited Peter Drummond at the manor, pressing for an account of his whereabouts, spoke with Mrs. Finch behind her tightly closed door. But suspicion, having found new fuel, shifted his focus. Some villagers whispered that Emily had planted the box herself, hoping to shift blame for the fate's missing money. Others muttered that Mrs. Brindle had staged the discovery to cover up her own mistakes. Still, others wondered aloud if Peter, in need of funds, had tried to force Finch's hand, only to be caught in the act. Evening brought no resolution, only a deeper uncertainty. Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Bantry, who was wild with speculation. It's as if every time we come close to the truth, the pieces fly apart again. What on earth was in that letter? Miss Marple considered. The answer may not lie in the letter itself, but in the reason it was hidden. Someone was desperate to keep it from the inspector's hands. Perhaps someone who feared what Finch had written. Or someone who feared what he knew. Mrs. Bantry shivered. But who could have gotten into the school garden? Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind turned over the puzzle. Footsteps in the night. A frightened young woman. A box concealed among the lilacs. The web was tightening, but still, the center remained elusive. Later, as dusk settled over St. Leonard's, Peter Drummond was seen near the church, pacing in the shadow of the old stone tower. Mrs. Brindle locked her doors and double-checked her windows. Emily Farrell, unable to sleep, wrote a long letter to her mother and left it on her desk, just in case. Miss Marple sat quietly in her cottage, listening to the ticking of the clock and the distant murmur of voices in the lane. In her mind, the facts lined up in careful rows, but one crucial thread still eluded her. Why had the box been hidden in the garden, and why was Finch's letter, unopened, placed with the fate accounts? Was the killer panicking, or did they want something found at just the right moment? One thing was clear. Someone in St. Leonard's was working very hard to direct suspicion, to confuse and delay. But misdirection, Miss Marple knew, was only a delaying tactic. The truth was always waiting, quiet and patient, for the right eye to see. As night descended and the village settled into uneasy silence, Miss Marple stared out at the moonlit green, certain of only one thing. The story of Harold Finch's murder was far from over, and the next revelation would change everything. Miss Marple's final testimony. Leonard's wore a brittle stillness the morning after the discovery in the school garden. Even the birds seemed wary, chirping in brief, cautious bursts before falling silent. The unease was sharper now. The news of the hidden box had traveled far beyond the green. Cool, and even neighboring villages were said to be muttering about the strange business at St. Leonard's. Yet beneath the surface commotion, Miss Marple sensed something else. The subtle tension of a mystery nearing its point of greatest pressure. Inspector Graves, who looked a decade older than he had at the start of the week, had called for another round of interviews at the vicarage. This time, however, he invited Miss Marple to join, not as a suspect, but as a trusted observer. You have a way with people, Mrs. Marple, he confided. Perhaps you'll see something I'm missing. Miss Marple agreed with a modest nod, though inside, she felt the electric tingle of anticipation. She was not above admitting that she enjoyed the chase, so long as it served justice. The vicarage's sitting room was hastily rearranged for the day's work. 2 chairs for the inspector and Miss Marple, another for each villager summoned in turn, and a side table set with tea and a plate of shortbread, courtesy of Mrs. Withers. Miss Marple took her place quietly, knitting in her lap, eyes attentive beneath the brim of her hat. The first to appear was Mrs. Brindle, her features pinched and defensive. She sat rigidly, hands gripping the arms of her chair. Mrs. Brindle, Graves began gently. Can you recall anyone behaving strangely at the fete, or later, in your home? Mrs. Brindle's gaze darted to Miss Marple, then back to the inspector. Everyone was anxious after the murder. I remember Peter Drummond came to speak with me about the accounts, but it was nothing unusual. Emily Farrell stopped by, looking for her lesson plan. And, well, Harold Finch himself was supposed to review the books that afternoon. He never did. Miss Marple's needles clicked quietly. Did Mr. Finch mention any concerns, Edith? Perhaps about the accounts, or something else? A nervous flush colored Mrs. Brindle's cheeks. He said something about being troubled by a letter he'd received, said he might need to speak to me privately, but he never did. Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, then released Mrs. Brindle with a few more questions. Is she left? Miss Marple murmured a gentle word of comfort, but Edith merely nodded, eyes fixed straight ahead. Next was Peter Drummond. He entered with the restless energy of a caged fox, hands clenched in his pockets, jaw set. Inspector Graves steered the conversation toward his relationship with Finch. I've told you already, Keita said, voice fraying at the edges. We argued about the will. He said there were things about the estate I didn't understand implied. I regret coming home. I thought he was just being patronizing. That was Finch's way. Miss Marple spoke, her tone soft but direct. Peter, did you ever see Harold Finch with a notebook or a letter in the hours before his death? He hesitated. He had a notebook, always scribbling in it. I didn't see a letter. I wouldn't have touched it. She watched him closely as he answered, noting the way he shifted in his seat, not quite discomfort, but a trace of worry. She thanked him and let him go. Emily Farrell was summoned next, her face drawn and anxious. She sat, clutching her hands together, glancing between Miss Marple and Graves. Emily, Graves said kindly about the letter in the box. You're sure you didn't touch anything else? She shook her head, then glanced down. No, I just opened the box, saw the ledger and papers, and called the inspector. She hesitated, then added, there's something else. I received another note last night, slipped under my door. She produced a small folded slip, which Graves opened and read aloud. Silence protects the innocent. Don't trust anyone. Collective hush fell. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. Emily, may I see the note? Emily handed it over. Miss Marple turned the paper over in her gloved hands, noting the odd slant of the handwriting of disguised effort. Perhaps, or simply the result of haste. Have you shown this to anyone else? Graves asked. Emily shook her head. No, only Ruth, and now you. Graves reassured her and allowed her to leave. Emily paused by the door, looking back at Miss Marple with silent pleading in her eyes. After a brief interval, Ruth Farrell entered. Her answers were precise and measured. I was at home with Emily the night the box appeared. We heard nothing until the children found it. Wish I could be of more help, but we keep to ourselves. It was nearly midday before Mrs. Finch, Harold's widow, appeared. She was pale, her face shadowed by grief, but she wore an expression of new resolve. She sat quietly, hands folded, her wedding band turning restlessly on her finger. Mrs. Finch, Miss Marple asked gently, was there anything troubling Harold in the days before his death? Anything he might have shared, or a worry you noticed? Mrs. Finch's voice was soft but steady. He was frightened, I think. There were letters he wouldn't let me see. He said someone was trying to ruin him, to use something from the past against him. Didn't say who, but he kept mentioning the fate. It all comes back to the fate, he said. Inspector Graves leaned forward. Did he say what sort of trouble? She shook her head. Only that if anything happened to him, the truth would come out. I think that's why he carried that notebook everywhere with the interviews. Finished, Graves thanked Miss Marple. Any thoughts, Mrs. Marple? She did not answer immediately. Instead, she requested permission to speak with Emily Farrell privately. Outside the vicarage, they walked beneath the ancient yew trees, away from listening ears. Miss Marple stopped and regarded Emily kindly. My dear, I think someone is trying to frighten you. Perhaps to keep you from remembering something you witnessed, something you might not realize is important. Emily's eyes widened. What should I do? Sometimes, the best thing is to act as though nothing has changed, Miss Marple advised. The guilty are never as clever as they believe. If you let them think you're still frightened, they may grow careless. Emily nodded, her trust in Miss Marple absolute. All right, I'll try. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Brindle, ostensibly about the garden club, but in reality, to observe. She made gentle conversation, watching as Mrs. Brindle's nerves made her clumsy, spilling tea, dropping a spoon, snapping at her cat. Then, quite suddenly, Mrs. Brindle blurted out, why does everyone think it was me? I tried to help. I tried so hard. Miss Marple offered soothing words, masking her careful study. She saw the flash of fear in Mrs. Brindle's eyes, the strain of carrying a secret too long. Edith, you're not to blame. Sometimes, people act out of desperation. They make mistakes. Mrs. Brindle slumped, looking close to tears. I only wanted the fate to be perfect. As she left, Miss Marple paused at the edge of the green. She watched as Peter Drummond walked quickly past, head down. Emily and Ruth passed by, speaking in low tones. Inspector Graves made his rounds, stern but weary. The village was a stage, each character playing their part, each holding tight to what they feared to lose. Miss Marple drew a slow breath. The pattern was nearly complete, but not quite. The guilty party, whoever they were, would soon betray themselves. She would be waiting. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat at her window, knitting set aside, gaze fixed on the shadows lengthening over St. Leonard's. The trap had been set not with accusations, Geist, but with gentle patience and subtle encouragement. Now, she knew it was only a matter of time before the mask slipped and the final thread revealed itself. Chapter 5. The reveal of the day dawned pale and uncertain. A thin mist curling around the eaves of St. Leonard's cottages and settling over the village green. Like a shroud, Miss Marple rose early, a faint stirring in her thoughts that promised resolution after a week of quiet observation and patient listening. The threads were taut, now ready to be drawn together in the final weave. She dressed with her usual care, donning a modest navy dress and her faded rose hat before setting off towards the vicarage, where Inspector Graves awaited. The morning summons had been sent out with unusual urgency. All principal parties involved were to assemble for a meeting with the inspector and Mrs. Marple. His reputation for discerning the truth had earned her a unique place beside the official inquiry as Miss Marple approached. The vicarage was already alive with tension. Mrs. Brindle was there, clutching a handkerchief, her face pale but resolute. Peter Drummond stood by the window, hands in pockets, casting restless glances toward the door. Emily Farrell sat quietly, her sister Ruth close at hand, while Mrs. Finch lingered near the fireplace, shoulders squared but eyes haunted. Inspector Graves greeted them all. "Thank you for coming. Today, we hope to bring some clarity to the confusion that has gripped our village." Miss Marple rose, knitting needles folded away, and addressed the room with a calm authority that drew every eye. "This week, I have watched carefully, listened to words spoken and unspoken, observed the smallest of gestures, and considered the weight of silence as much as that of confession. In a village such as ours, secrets are woven into everyday life, but murder demands that some threads must be pulled until the whole pattern is revealed." She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to settle. The murder of Harold Finch was no act of chance, no random violence. It was an event born of fear, resentment, and a desire to keep certain truths buried. The question is not who wanted him dead, but rather who feared most what he might reveal. Her eyes scanned the room before settling briefly on Mrs. Brindle. "Edith, you spoke of discrepancies in the Fates accounts. You worried over missing receipts and odd calls. And yet, when the accounts and ledger box appeared at the school, the money was accounted for. What troubled you was not the funds themselves, but what Mr. Finch was about to uncover." Mrs. Brindle's mouth trembled. I was afraid, not of money, but of what Harold might find. "I did not kill him." Miss Marple nodded gently. "No, Edith, you did not. But your fears speak to a deeper secret one that Harold was close to unraveling." Turning then to Peter Drummond, Miss Marple's gaze softened, but remained unwavering. "Peter, your quarrel with Harold over the estate was well known, but it was your past that weighed heaviest on you. Harold hinted at knowledge you wished, kept hidden, something from before your return to St. Leonard's." Peter swallowed hard. "It's true. There are mistakes in my past I wish never to revisit. I would never kill over them. Your fear made you a suspect, Peter, but not the murderer, okay?" All eyes shifted to Emily Farrell, who sat as still as a statue, fingers clasped tightly. Miss Marple's voice lowered. "Emily, you received threatening notes, and someone tried to frighten you into silence. That was meant to protect a secret, perhaps yours, perhaps another's. You were frightened, but innocent of murder." Emily's eyes shone with tears, but she nodded, relieved. Miss Marple's final glance was reserved for Mrs. Finch. "You spoke of Harold's fear of past letters and threats, and his conviction that the truth would out. You bore your grief silently, but you carry a knowledge that others do not." Mrs. Finch's lips parted slightly. "I only know he wanted to protect the village from something that had been buried for years." Miss Marple took a breath, then turned to Inspector Graves. The missing notebook, the torn note with the initials E.F., the hidden letter found with the Fates account. So, these are pieces of a puzzle connected by one thread. And that thread leads us to the person who feared exposure more than any other. Sharon looked slowly around the room, the silence thick. It was Mrs. Withers. A gasp escaped Mrs. Brindle's lips. Mrs. Withers, who had, until then, sat quietly, adjusting her gloves, looked startled. Miss Marple continued. "Mrs. Withers has lived here for years, known for her impeccable manners and devotion to the church. Yet, behind that veneer lay a secret that Harold Finch discovered, one that threatened her standing in the village." Graves leaned forward. "What secret?" Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with gentle severity. "Many years ago, when Mrs. Withers was younger and less circumspect, she was involved in a reckless act that could have destroyed a family's reputation. Harold Finch uncovered evidence of this, sealed in letters and notes he kept close, including the letter found with the fate accounts." Mrs. Withers's composure cracked. She covered her mouth with a trembling hand. "It's true," she whispered. "I feared that if Harold revealed the past, the village would shun me. I begged him to keep silent, but he refused. The night before the fate, I confronted him at the well. It was meant to be a plea, not an act of violence." Graves interjected. "Mrs. Withers, the stab wound was precise, indicative of premeditation. How do you explain that?" Tears filled her eyes. "I was desperate. He threatened to ruin everything, did not intend to kill, only to scare him. But in the struggle, the knife slipped." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It was the fear of losing everything that led to tragedy." The missing notebook contained correspondence that proved her knowledge and motive. When the box with the fate accounts was hidden in the garden, it was a last attempt to divert suspicion. The room was silent, except for the soft sobs of Mrs. Withers. Inspector Graves rose, signaling constables to approach. "Mrs. Withers, you will have your day in court. But know this, your actions, though grave, arose from human frailty, not cruelty." As Mrs. Withers was gently led away, Miss Marple looked around at the remaining villagers. Harold Finch's death has shaken St. Leonard's, but it has also unearthed truths we might have preferred to keep hidden. Let this be a reminder that even the most genteel facades conceal complicated lives. Mrs. Brindle wiped her eyes. Thank you, Jane. You have seen what we could not. Peter Drummond exhaled deeply. Emily Farrell smiled faintly. Mrs. Finch appeared to find some peace. Miss Marple gathered her knitting. The village will heal. Cool, but only if it remembers that the threads which bind us are as fragile as they are strong. As she stepped outside, the sun broke through the mist, casting golden light across the green. St. Leonard's, bruised, but still standing, seemed to breathe again, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, prepared to follow the next thread wherever it might lead. Aftermath, the heavy clouds that had hung over St. Leonard's for days finally lifted, allowing a pale sun to wash the village green in soft light. The air was still cool, but the tension that had gripped the village seemed to loosen, as though the revelation of the week had released an invisible weight, yet beneath the surface. Unease lingered like a faint echo, reminders of the fracture that had unsettled the peaceful veneer. Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, her steps measured, as always, her eyes quietly taking in the subtle shifts in atmosphere. The fake grounds, once alive with laughter and music, now bore the scars of upheaval. A bent signpost, a half-folded banner, chairs stacked awkwardly under the chestnut tree. Yet even here, life's resilience showed. Daisies sprouted among the stones, and the scent of fresh earth mingled with the faint aroma of Mrs. Wither's overgrown garden. At the bakery, Mrs. Cobb greeted Miss Marple with a cautious smile. "It's good to see you out and about, Jane," she said, lowering her voice. "Things have settled a bit, but the village is not the same." "No, Mabel," Miss Marple replied gently. "When something so terrible happens, it leaves its mark, but it is also a chance for reflection and growth." Outside, Peter Drummond was arranging a small bouquet by the churchyard gate. His face was calmer, the lines of worry softened by the passing days. He looked up and offered a nod. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Marple," he said quietly. "For seeing beyond the suspicion." Miss Marple smiled. "We all carry our pasts, Peter, but it is how we face them that defines us." Passing the village green, she spotted Emily Farrell speaking softly with Ruth and Mrs. Brindle. The schoolmistress's shoulders were straighter, her smile tentative but genuine. It seemed the dark cloud of fear was lifting, replaced by a cautious hope. Later, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Finch. The widow received her with quiet dignity. The pain of loss softened, but not gone. "Thank you for your kindness," Mrs. Finch said. "Harold always believed that truth was the only way forward, no matter how difficult. I hope the village finds peace." Miss Marple nodded. "Peace comes slowly, but it does come. And in truth, St. Leonard's has always had a remarkable way of healing itself." That evening, Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair by the fire, knitting, resting on her lap as she reflected on the recent events. The murder, the secrets uncovered, the lives laid bare was a reminder of how thin the line could be between civility and chaos. She thought of Mrs. Withers, whose desperation had led to tragedy, of Peter, burdened by his past, of Emily, caught between fear and courage, and of the village itself, a community both fragile and fiercely protective. Each had played a part in a story far larger than themselves. As the fire crackled softly, Miss Marple considered the nature of justice, not only the law's version, but the delicate balance of truth, forgiveness, and understanding that held the fabric of a village together. In St. Leonard's, justice was not only served in courtrooms, but in whispered conversations, in cautious reconciliations, and in the daily acts of kindness that followed hardship. Outside, stars began to emerge, twinkling over the sleeping village. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, grateful for the stillness and the certainty that, despite everything, life would continue tomorrow. Deluge would awaken anew, and the threads of his story would continue to unravel and intertwine. But for now, peace reigned, fragile and precious, and in that peace, Miss Marple found a quiet hope. Chapter 6. Ripples in the quiet the weeks following. Mrs. Withers's confession and arrest passed with a peculiar mixture of relief and lingering unease. St. Leonard's had begun to knit itself back together, yet the fabric showed signs of strained small frays in relationships and silences where once there had been easy laughter. The village had survived the storm, but its pulse remained cautious. Miss Marple noticed these undercurrents as she resumed her daily walks. The village green, now free of the fate's clutter, held a softer beauty. The grass grew tall in places, wildflowers nodding gently in the breeze. The church bells rang with steady solemnity. But there was a new solemnity to their peal. Passing the bakery, she saw Mrs. Cobb arranging a display of fresh bread with practiced hands, her face lined with a weariness that was not all physical. "Good morning, Jane," she greeted. "The village feels quieter these days. Not all good quiet, if you ask me." Miss Marple smiled. "Peace can be complicated, Mabel. Sometimes it is a silence that asks to be heard." Further along, Peter Drummond tended the graveyard with a quiet reverence. The soil was freshly turned where Harold Finch's headstone stood, a simple but dignified memorial. Peter's eyes caught Miss Marple's as she paused. "Thank you for your support," he said softly. "It's been a hard road, but I think I'm beginning to find my place here again." "You've shown courage, Peter," Miss Marple replied. "The past can be a heavy burden, but it need not define the future." At the school, Emily Farrell's presence was a balm to the children who had been frightened by the upheaval. Though still pale and somewhat withdrawn, she returned to teaching. with gentle determination. One afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by unexpectedly, finding Emily arranging desks. "Emily," she began, "how do you find the village now?" Emily hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Better, I think. Sometimes I still feel watching it in a bad way, but as though people are waiting for me to falter." Miss Marple nodded. "That is the nature of recovery. Trust takes time." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, reflecting on the village's resilience and fragility. She thought of Mrs. Brindle, who had thrown herself into community work with renewed fervor, as if to erase the shadow cast by the tragedy, and of Mrs. Finch, who had taken up organizing charity events in Harold's memory, seeking to channel grief into hope. Yet, beneath the surface, the undercurrents of suspicion and fear had not entirely vanished. Miss Marple often caught glimpses of quiet conversations halting as she approached, or of guarded glances exchanged in the marketplace. The murder had exposed fault lines in the village's social fabric lines that would require careful mending. One evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple received a visit from Inspector Graves. He brought news of the court proceedings against Mrs. Withers, which had begun quietly, but with inevitable public interest. "The trial has brought up some painful memories," Graves said, settling into the chair opposite her. "The village is divided. Some sympathize, others remain unforgiving. It's a difficult time." Miss Marple nodded. "Justice must be tempered with understanding, Inspector. Sometimes the hardest truths to face are those about ourselves." Ate spoke for some time, sharing reflections on human nature and the burdens people carry. Graves admitted that the case had tested him in ways unexpected, how easily fear and desperation could lead to tragedy. As he left, Miss Marple watched him go, aware that the story was far from over. The law might have spoken, but the heart of St. Leonard's still beat with questions about forgiveness, about trust, and about the fragility of peace in the days that followed. The village began to prepare for its first social event since the murderer, modest gathering at the village hall to mark the return of normalcy. Mrs. Brindle, though still shadowed by recent events, took charge, determined to restore community spirit. Miss Marple found herself invited to assist, not as an organizer, but as a guest whose calm presence reassured others. The event promised laughter and music, a tentative step toward healing. On the evening of the gathering, the hall was filled with familiar faces, some smiling, some wary. Conversations were cautious at first, but gradually warmed as the night wore on. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting how old friendships rekindled and new ones sparked, even as some villagers remained distant, nursing wounds unseen. As the evening ended, Mrs. Brindle approached Miss Marple. "Thank you for being here, Jane. Your presence has meant more than you know." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It is in moments like these that we remember why community matters, despite everything." Walking home under a starlit sky, Miss Marple felt a quiet hope stir within her. St. Leonard's was bruised but not broken. The threads of its story were being rewoven more carefully, perhaps, but with an enduring strength. And as the village settled into night's embrace, Miss Marple looked forward with steady eyes. For every mystery solved, every truth uncovered, there remained the delicate task of living and learning to forgive. The shadows beneath the surface, the cool breath of autumn, had begun to whisper through the trees of St. Leonard's, brushing the leaves into soft rustles and painting the hedgerows in muted gold and crimson. The village itself appeared to be settling into a tentative calm, but Miss Marple, with her sharp eye for detail, knew well that beneath this calm, small shadows stirred. On her morning walk, she noticed how the early frost caught the edges of spiderwebs in the hedgerows, delicate threads glistening briefly before the sun burned them away. It was a quiet reminder, she thought, of the fragility of things unseen yet present, much like the delicate balance of trust and suspicion that still lingered in the village. The bakery. The usual bustle resumed, but Miss Marple observed a subtle shift in the conversations. The whispers had not entirely died down. Instead, they had taken on a softer, more guarded tone. People spoke cautiously, avoiding certain names or changing subjects when eyes turned toward the past weeks. Grim events. Mrs. Cobb greeted Miss Marple with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "It's good to see you about again, Jane. I suppose the village is trying to move on, but sometimes it feels as if we're all just waiting for what? I can't say." Miss Marple nodded knowingly. "The waiting is often the hardest part, Mabel. It gives room for old fears to resurface in unexpected ways." Later, she met Peter Drummond near the churchyard, tending once again to the grave of Harold Finch. His hands were steady now. The tension around his shoulders eased, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something guarded in his expression. "Peter," she said gently, "how do you find yourself after all that has passed?" He looked up, offering a small, rueful smile. "Better, I think, though some days are harder than others. It's strange, the way the past keeps knocking." Double quotes. Miss Marple smiled softly. "We are all shadows of our pasts, but it is how we carry those shadows that defines us." The school, too, had regained a rhythm. Emily Farrell returned to her classes with renewed resolve, supported by the community's careful encouragement. Yet, Miss Marple noticed how Emily sometimes lingered by the windows, gazing out with a distant look, as if listening for something only she could hear. One afternoon, as the leaves tumbled across the green, Miss Marple sat in the village hall during a quiet moment of a committee meeting led by Mrs. Brindle. The women discussed plans for the winter fair. Voices lively but tinged with a cautious optimism. Mrs. Brindle's sharp eyes flickered occasionally to the doorway, as if expecting something or someone. Afterward, Miss Marple approached her. "Edith, you seem burdened still. Is there something you wish to share?" Later, as she wandered near the churchyard, Miss Marple saw Peter Drummond speaking quietly with Ruth Farrell. Their conversation was earnest, their faces serious. As she approached, Peter glanced her way and offered a small, tired smile. "It's difficult," he admitted. "It's not just the past, but the fear that it might never truly leave us." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle. "The past shapes us, Peter, but it need not define us. It's what we choose to do now that matters most." That evening, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Brindle, who was sitting by the fire, hands clasped tightly around a cup of tea. "Edith," Miss Marple began softly. "The letters you found, they revealed much, did they not?" Mrs. Brindle nodded, eyes distant. "They did. More than I expected. They speak of promises broken, of trust betrayed. I fear the village may never be the same." Miss Marple offered a comforting smile. "Its change is the nature of life, but so is resilience. St. Leonard's will find its way." As days passed, the villagers slowly began to face their intertwined pasts. Conversations grew more open, and where there had been silence, there emerged cautious honesty. One afternoon, Emily Farrell confided in Miss Marple that she had written a letter to her mother, expressing hopes for a future unburdened by fear. "I want to believe," Emily said, "that this village can be home again." Miss Marple squeezed her hand. "And it will be, because here, beneath the surface, there is kindness." As winter deepened, St. Leonard settled into a new rhythm, marked by memory but not trapped by it. Miss Marple sat by her window one evening, knitting quietly, the soft crackle of the fire accompanying her thoughts. The story of the murder had reached its conclusion, but the village's story was far from over. Its threads woven from secrets, forgiveness, and hope continued to intertwine in delicate patterns. She smiled to herself, knowing that sometimes the greatest mysteries were not those solved, but those lived. Chapter 8 Epilogue. In reflection, winter. Pale light filtered softly through the frosted panes of Miss Marple's sitting room as she settled into her familiar chair by the fire. The quiet crackle of burning logs mingled with the rhythmic click of her knitting needles, weaving the fabric of another calm afternoon. Outside, the village of St. Leonard's lay draped in a gentle hush, snow-dusted roofs and leafless branches casting long shadows in the fading day. It was a time for reflection, both for Miss Marple and for the village she knew so well. The recent months had been filled with upheaval, secrets uncovered, relationships tested, and lives irrevocably altered. Yet now, as the snow thawed and the first timid crocuses broke through the earth, a fragile peace had returned. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the people who had shaped the narrative, their joys, fears, and failings, all entwined in the delicate tapestry of human nature. Peter Drummond had slowly reclaimed his place in the community, his restless spirit tempered by the lessons of the past. She recalled the haunted look he once bore, the weight of old mistakes pressing on him like a shadow, and she took comfort in his quiet efforts to build a better future. For all his faults, he was a man seeking redemption, and the village had offered him a second chance. Emily Farrell's gentle courage had been a balm to many. Her vulnerability, exposed in those difficult weeks, had blossomed into a quiet strength that inspired others to face their own fears. Miss Marple admired her resilience, the way she moved forward despite uncertainty. A living reminder that even the smallest voices could speak profound truths. Mrs. Brindle, too, had transformed. No longer merely the formidable organizer of village affairs, she had shown vulnerability beneath her resolute exterior. The letters she discovered had shattered illusions, but also offered a chance for honesty and reconciliation. Her willingness to confront the past and to help the village do the same had been an essential thread in the healing process. And then there was Mrs. Withers. Miss Marple recalled the tremor of desperation in her confession, the tragic consequences born of fear and pride. She was a reminder that even those we think we know best can harbor secrets that threaten to unravel everything. Most of all, Miss Marple reflected on the village itself, a community bound not just by geography, but by shared history, whispered confidences, and the quiet understanding that, no matter the fractures, belonged to something larger than themselves. St. Leonard's had endured the test, bruised but unbroken, its spirit renewed by the very trials that threatened to tear it apart. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple's door opened softly, and Mrs. Bantry entered, a tray with 2 cups of tea, balanced carefully. She smiled warmly. "I thought you might like some company, Jane. It's been a long few months." Miss Marple gestured to the chair beside her. "Thank you, Dolly. I was just thinking how much we all rely on one another, especially in times like these." They sat together, the firelight casting a gentle glow, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. "Do you ever tire of all this, Jane? The mysteries, the secrets?" Mrs. Bantry asked quietly. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Not really. People are endlessly fascinating, their kindness, their failings, the threads that connect them. Every story is a new puzzle, and every puzzle reveals a little more about what it means to be human." Mrs. Bantry nodded thoughtfully. I suppose that's why the village feels alive, even after everything, 'cause we keep weaving those threads, no matter how tangled they seem. Miss Marple took a sip of tea, her gaze drifting to the window where the stars had begun to sparkle. Yes, she said softly. Life is, after all, a tapestry, some bright threads, some dark, all woven together. It is our hope and our courage that give it meaning. The night deepened around them, the village settling into its peaceful rhythm once more. Outside, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the soft murmur of the wind all whispered the enduring story of St. Leonard's, and within the quiet walls of her cottage, Miss Marple knit on, her needles clicking in steady rhythm, weaving the final threads of a mystery that had tested hearts and revealed truths. For in the end, the greatest mysteries are not those of crime or consequence, but those of the human spirit, and in those mysteries, Miss Marple had always found her true calling.